It's my pleasure to introduce someone who's been at the helm of RNS's editorial vision since 2020, Paul O'Donnell, Editor-in-Chief of RNS. Paul's going to share a few thoughts as we prepare for tonight's keynote discussion, featuring, as you've heard, Marty Baron, former editor of the Washington Post, in conversation with RNS's own Adelle Banks, projects editor and national reporter. We'd like to welcome to the stage now as well. Adelle is RNS's longest-serving journalist, having been with RNS for 29 years. This year, she won the Lifetime Achievement Award from the Religion News Association. Now I'm going to turn it over to Paul O'Donnell.
Thanks, everybody, for being here. It's been a great day, and you guys made it a great day, so thank you very much. I once heard religion defined, in a sermon no less, as tales told by women at the hearth to explain the world to their children that were taken up by men for the purposes of power. You can quibble with the first part, and we could have a panel on that. But you can't deny that religion and power go together, that it has been used for power as long as humans have been around. Journalists like to think that we keep an eye on power, that we're a check on power, that we keep power accountable. And I think Marty Baron is a model, and the Boston Globe and the Spotlight investigation is a model of exactly that, of checking power in the religious context. And I think the important thing to remember about the crimes that were committed, that were uncovered and investigated by Spotlight, is that they don't belong to any one faith. They don't belong to any one denomination. It happens everywhere. It happens wherever, unfortunately, wherever religion exists, this particular crime seems to happen. And so, to press an investigation in one place, I think opened up a discussion for all faiths, and made us all aware of these problems. And it's clerical power, it's individual, interpersonal power, as well as institutional power. And Marty Baron, of course, was the first mover and the editor of that investigation. And I'm really looking forward to this conversation with Adelle Banks about that time and what it meant to journalism. I have to add that I don't know Marty, but we all know him, and I think it's worth pointing out that Spotlight was not the only flashpoint in his career. I believe in 2000, Marty, you were an editor at the Miami Herald when Florida became the epicenter of American politics as the recount in the presidential election went on. I'm so glad I did not have your job at that time. And a decade ago and a little more, Marty was the executive editor at the Washington Post when many of us walked down to the end of our driveway and opened up the paper and saw what was then a futuristic headline that said, Amazon founder Jeff Bezos buys the Washington Post, which to me was just so deeply imprinted that we were in a different era. And I think we all watched as Marty Baron figured out what this new era is going to be in a way. And so we all owe him that debt as well. And I'm interested to hear, particularly Marty, to be interviewed by Adelle Banks. I think the 90th anniversary of RNS, it's appropriate to note that How has it been stuck on 29 years for like 4 years? But Adele is our longest serving reporter, and one of the most beloved, one of the most well-known, and one of the most decorated religion reporters in the business. Adele covers religion and politics. Adele covers the Southern Baptist Convention. Adele covers the Black Church for RNS. And her work is esteemed roundly. And as editor, I hear about it all the time. Her work has really been enough for 2 lifetimes of any other reporter, which I know because I've been on hand in less than the past 2 years. I've been on hand as Adele has won not one but 2 Lifetime Achievement Awards. One from the Washington Association of Black Journalists in December of 2022, their inaugural such award, and then in April of this year won the Lifetime Achievement Award from the Religion News Association at our meeting in Pittsburgh. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation. 2 really capable and interesting journalists, and I hope you enjoy it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Paul. And thank you, Marty, for joining us. We're so happy to have you here. You have overseen the editorial coverage of several prominent newspapers, but you have said that the Boston Globe Spotlight investigation of sexual abuse in the Catholic Church is the story that you are most proud of in your career. Given that, how would you describe your perspective on religion coverage and its significance in journalism?
Well, I think it's incredibly important. I've always felt that way. Actually, while I was at the Boston Globe, we had a terrific religion reporter in Michael Paulson for many, many years, and then we decided to add a second reporter as well, Lisa Wangsness. And I've always felt that it's incredibly important in people's lives because there are about 50% of the American population identifies themselves as being religious, something like 60% pray every day, 30% say they're spiritual, and you can see that play out in politics, as you well know. And I've never felt that the press did a very good job of covering religion for, I think, a variety of reasons. One reason is that most of us are fairly secular, and I think the other reason is that it's incredibly complex. Theology is incredibly complex. There's so many different denominations. There's so many different belief sets, and it doesn't generate like today's story. I mean, there's not. It's beneath the surface. It's not on the surface, and so I think those are several reasons why. But because it's so important, because it motivates and drives so many people and informs their behavior in daily life and in politics and. I've always felt that it's incredibly important to cover, and that's not why we ended up doing the Catholic Church story. It just happened to be a good story that was staring us in the face that we weren't doing before I got there. So, as was mentioned before, journalists like good stories, and I saw that there was a story that we needed to dig into.
But you were in uber Catholic Boston, a community that probably didn't think it was going to be questioned the way you did, and the way you let the reporters question it. What motivated you to do that when some people might not have had the courage to do that?
It was a good story. Journalist, simple as that. I was coming from Miami. My former boss, Alberto Ibargüen, is here. He was my publisher, and Alberto's recently retired as CEO of the Knight Foundation, and Miami was it's a crazy place. There was a lot of news happening there. I was a little worried that Boston there wouldn't be quite as interesting. Well,
that certainly didn't turn out to be.
It didn't work out that way, but. I was reading very closely what we were doing, and then the day before I started work, there was a column written by a Pulitzer Prize winning columnist, Eileen McNamara, who by then I had met, and she talked about this case of a priest by the name of Father John Gagan, and he was accused of having abused as many as 80 kids. And And she said that, so the lawyer for the plaintiff said that the cardinal himself, Cardinal Law, was aware of that abuse and yet continually reassigned that priest from parish to parish without notifying anybody, not the parish priest, not the parishioners, and certainly not the public. And so, and then at the end of the column, she had an interesting ending to it, and she said the truth may never be known. And because the internal documents that might reveal the church, the internal church documents, were under a court seal, under a confidentiality order. The cardinal had flat out denied this accusation. And you know, when somebody says the truth may never be known, that should be like chum to journalists. And it was chum to me at that moment, particularly as a guy who was wondering, like, where are the good stories in Boston? And so I went into our news meeting the next day, and everybody went around the table talking about department heads and assistant department heads about what story they were intending to work on, and nobody mentioned this case. And I said, well, I just read this story about this whole case. Can't we get beyond one side says one thing and the other side says something else? Can't we get to the truth of the matter? And somebody piped up, well, you know, the documents are under seal. And I said, I know, I read that in the column. So, but, you know, I'm not from Massachusetts, but in Florida, where there have big public records cases, these are not public records, but our instinct would have been to try to get those documents. Have we thought about doing that? And it was just silent, just total silence. I think that people were a little surprised that their new editor on his first day at his first meeting would talk about doing something that would challenge the most powerful institution in all of New England. And so I said, well, why don't we talk about it afterwards? And so we did, and we got our outside lawyer on the phone, and he said that he would like look into the case and whether we might actually bring a lawsuit to try to get access to those documents. And I went to Eileen. She was passing by, and I said, hey, we might go to court to get these documents. And she said, yeah, but this newspaper's never done a proper investigation. And I said, is that true? And she said, yeah, it's true. And so we called the Spotlight team together, and then the lawyer got back to us, and he told us, you know, assess the law, the case, the judge, everything that was relevant. And then at the end, I said, well, what are the odds that we're going to prevail? And like a good lawyer, he said, 50-50. And I said, well, those are good odds for journalists, you know. I'll take those odds. So we went ahead with it, and that's how the story got launched. And then the Spotlight team took it from there.
The work of the Globe Spotlight team was featured in Spotlight, the movie, and I was struck by how it depicted the nuts and bolts of investigative journalism, including, you can tell me if this is what really happened, using Catholic directories to find the names of the priests categorized in particular ways, and also reporters knocking on doors. And I wonder whether you worry that might be harder to accomplish in these days of smaller newsrooms and fewer news outlets.
Well, you know, that is what happened, actually. They did go to the directories, and they saw that certain priests were assigned to a particular facility, and that was known as the facility where people were sent. And so you could actually count up the number of, for priests who were credibly accused of abuse, they were sent there, and you could count up how many there were over a certain period of time. And they developed a spreadsheet, just as the movie reflects, and then came back and reported it. I think that's doable in any newsroom. It's just a lot of manual labor. It's tedious. I mean, I think one of the great things about the movie is that it shows the tedium involved in reporting. It's like, you know, there's just a lot of sitting and reading through documents and reading through them carefully and tallying things up and talking to people and all of that, doing the basics. And so I do think that work can be done today. The reality is that there are a lot of news organizations, including many small ones, as evidenced by some of the Pulitzer prizes that have been handed out, that is being fantastic investigative work being done by small news organizations. And I think it's a great sign about our journalism, a great sign that we still have the capacity and most importantly, the will to do that kind of work. And I'm very proud of that, and I'm glad to see it at news organizations of all sizes.
Glad to hear there's some hope in your mind. Paul O'Donnell mentioned the issue of power, my editor. There is a clear power dynamic when covering stories about sexual abuse, both for the religious institutions that appear to have control and the victims of abuse who may feel powerless. How do you view the lasting effects of the Spotlight investigation and other similar journalistic investigations, which include churches that have closed due to bankruptcy, people who may have lost their faith, and as a result of learning things they didn't want to know about their religious institutions?
Yeah, well, I think it's important to point out that this was not an attack on the church. This was, the reality is that the church was betraying its parishioners and betraying its principles. Principles are valuable. And I think a lot of the reason that we were not attacked actually in Boston by parishioners as we expected to be was that they realized that they had been betrayed and that their principles had been betrayed. And so that was deeply disturbing to them. You know, clearly it's had a huge impact on the church and an impact on the clergy. And I've had clergy come up to me and say that, you know, it affected us, obviously, very personally. But it needed to be done. And I have told them that, you know, I've heard a lot from survivors, and that means a lot to me, but hearing that from clergy as well, it means a lot to me to hear it from them. So the impact, I've focused a lot on the impact on what it means in terms of, I think it demonstrated, first of all, it demonstrated to the public the need for investigative reporting. It demonstrated just how hard it is to do that kind of work and how hard it is to do it correctly. It demonstrated that it's something really at the core of our mission. It demonstrated, I think, very importantly, to a lot of editors and publishers and owners that you can't let this investigative journalism atrophy. That it's actually at the heart of who we are and what our mission is, and that the public wants us and expects us to do that kind of work. And it signaled that, I think particularly importantly, that we need to listen to people who don't have power, because they often have very powerful things to say. And we have the capacity to do that. It's not always easy to do that. You know, my former colleague at the Globe, who worked on the Spotlight team, who's portrayed in the movie, Sasha Pfeiffer, said, you know, it's difficult because some people are coming to you and they seem a little crazy. But the reality is that they've been driven crazy by what has happened to them and the fact that they're not being listened to. And so I think that's really important. And then I think it has had a significant effect on on holding other institutions accountable. Southern Baptist Convention is an example of that, institution you cover. Many others. I mean, people have written about how, in a way, it led to a lot of the Me Too work. It had an impact on other institutions like the Boy Scouts and Penn State, and it continues to reverberate throughout the world. I've spent a fair amount of time recently in Spain, and of course, they now are dealing with this, and there's been a couple of reports that have come out in Spain, and it continues to reverberate around the world, but I think it's affected other religious institutions as well. But very importantly, based on my career, reminded the press that it needs to do this kind of work, no matter how powerful the institution. Because my view, people would often ask me, well, weren't you concerned about the power of the church in New England? And my answer is that, look, the more powerful the institution, the greater the obligation, because there's the greater capacity to do wrong and the greater the capacity to cover it up. And so if we have, as an institution, as a journalistic institution, have a capacity to hold another institution accountable, we have an absolute duty to do that.
Thank you. So let's switch to another paper. As you led the Washington Post and its coverage of religion, whether it's on the front page or the religion page, what did you see as your goals there and the accomplishments at that newspaper related to religion journalism and the staffing of it?
Well, we had two reporters, as I recall, at the Post who were covering religion. One of them was Michelle Borstein, and then we had others. Sarah Pulliam-Bailey was covering religion, and that was a great addition to our staff as well, because she came from an evangelical background. She went to Wheaton College, And we actually hired 2 people from evangelical backgrounds. Paige Cunningham was working in covering healthcare. She too had gone to Wheaton College. She was homeschooled. I've lost count of how many brothers and sisters she had, but there were a lot. Every time I mention the number, she says, no, it was more than that. And they brought a perspective and a knowledge, particularly Sarah in covering religion, about evangelical communities in this country, which frankly the press doesn't understand very well. And that's stunning, given the influence of evangelicals in this country, and we need to understand that better, and not just white evangelicals. Latino evangelicals are hugely important, particularly now, probably particularly during this election, given their cultural affinity with the Republican Party. And so I don't know how you can cover politics and not really understand that. And we need to, I thought it was important at the Post that we covered those communities really well. And I hope we did that. We did, probably didn't do everything we were supposed to do, but I'm quite proud of the coverage.
Thank you. It's interesting you point out both the journalistic experience of the people you hire as well as their background that helps inform their ability to report on certain topics.
Oh, totally. I mean, I think it's very important in a newsroom that we hire people of all sorts of different backgrounds, in a lot of different ways. But religion is one of those, and basically, the life experience that people have had, I think, is incredibly important in keeping us informed about. We need to hear about what's happening in the country, and if we all, every person's life experience is by definition narrow. It's just us, okay? And so it's very important that we be exposed to what other people have experienced and hear from them and be willing to listen to what it is they have to say, because the truth is, in truth, we just know very little, and we need to be exposed to a lot more.
Well said. Today's symposium has focused on issues related to the state of democracy, including Christian nationalism and authoritarianism. The Washington Post is published under the slogan, "Democracy Dies in Darkness." How would you describe the health of democracy and the role of the press in addressing it?
Oh, everybody's doing great. That's great. Couldn't be better.
That solves that.
Yeah. Next question. No. I think, look, this country faces a huge number of threats with regard to democracy. Without being partisan, the kinds of things that Donald Trump is talking about are the measures that you see in authoritarian countries. That's just a fact, okay? Talk about using the military to suppress legitimate protests, talking about putting your political enemies, bringing treason charges against them, subjecting them to military tribunals. It's just a fact that those are the kinds of things that authoritarians have done in other countries. And so, we should think about that, and think about, we shouldn't take our democracy for granted. It's much more fragile. I think one of the lessons of, the last, however many years is that our democracy is more fragile than we ever imagined, and that we shouldn't take anything for granted. And the press obviously plays an incredibly important role. We are in that thing called the First Amendment. We are mentioned prominently and specifically about the role of an independent press. And I always try to remind people that when, James Madison was the principal author of the First Amendment, and he talked about, the quote is, the reason for having the First Amendment was the need for freely examining public characters and measures. So freely, I hope we understand. Public characters being the politicians, the government officials, the people with power who influence our daily lives, the measures, the policies that they implement. But the word really to focus on is the word examining. And that is that we're not stenographers, okay? We're not activists, but we're not stenographers either. We have to look behind the curtain. We have to look beneath the surface. That's our absolute duty. And I view those words from James Madison as essentially the original assignment given to the independent press in this country. And we should respect that deliver on that promise. And if we don't, we're abdicating our responsibilities. Are we doing it well enough? I think there's a lot of good work, really good work going on out there. I think that, but I think, it can always be better. I mean, everything about the press can always be better. And we are held accountable like everybody else. And I think people know the candidates pretty well at this point. I mean, Kamala Harris has only been in the race for a very short period of time, so I think there's a lot more to know about her. And there's still a lot more to know about Donald Trump, and I think it's important that we focus on the policies that he would implement and the people that he would draw upon to implement those policies. Who are they? What is their background? What is their inclination? What is their political philosophy? And I think there's still a lot more to be done in that area. Religion actually plays an important role in that, because there will be a lot of important policy decisions about religion in schools and obviously the cultural issues like abortion and all of that. So abortion rights. And so I think it's important that we just continue to cover the policy. Obviously, an election is a horse race, so you can't ignore the horse race. But I think it's very important that the American public understand what they're getting, depending on who they choose to select as the next president of the United States.
Thank you. We have time for maybe one more question from me, and then there's an opportunity, I understand, with the roving mic perhaps, for some of you to be able to ask a question or two before we wrap up. So I first want to ask you, you're known for leading traditional journalism business, but you have voiced optimism about the future of journalism, in part because of the growth of nonprofit journalism. Given that RNS fits into that subgenre of the news, I'm wondering what makes you hopeful about nonprofit journalism.
Right. Well, I've been called an old school journalist, and I hate that, by the way. I truly do. I mean, I'm old school in terms of what our values are. I think that we should adhere to our traditional values of being objective, open-minded, independent, doing our jobs with rigor and honesty, and doing them honorably and fairly. But I think the way that we tell stories and the way that we disseminate stories has changed dramatically and will have to change, and I'm a big supporter of that. Nonprofit news is just one example of the things that I think are promising. I think there's some commercial enterprises that are doing quite well also, and so I think it's great that we see that. I think that there is now a recognition among at least a segment of the American public, a bigger segment of the American public, that they shouldn't take an independent press for granted. There are too many who still do. But I think there's a growing portion of the American public that now recognizes, often because of what's happening in their local communities, that nobody's covering the police, nobody's covering the arts, nobody's covering the local sports, they're not covering the things that divide us, and they're not covering the things that bind us. They're not covering anything. And they realize that that's because their newspaper has just disappeared. And so nobody's paying attention and nobody's participating. And so a lot of news organizations have cropped up. A lot of them with the support of the Knight Foundation, which is the primary funder of journalism in this country, and under Alberto's leadership, has done tremendous work, and I see that some people are doing it right, not everybody, because journalists are some of them think that we're a religion, but that we're doing God's work, so therefore. Manna should fall from heaven, and like dollars falling from heaven. And I keep looking up, and I don't know, nothing's falling down. And so we got to figure out how to make a sustainable enterprise. And so there are a lot that have figured it out. They're hiring good business people. They're hiring technology people. They're hiring good fundraisers. They are doing good journalism, and they're making a difference. And some of them have won Pulitzer Prizes at the local level. And that's not the total measure of good work. The measure of good work is whether people have chosen to read you. I always say that it's a lot easier. It's as hard as it is to win a Pulitzer Prize, it's a lot harder to win readers. And we should be focusing on how to win readers. And many of them are doing that and showing promise. And I feel good about that. And I like to be an optimist. I don't always sound like an optimist, I admit. A lot of times I do these things and somebody raises their hand and says, "Do you have anything optimistic to say?" But I think it's important that we remain optimists because I've never known anybody to succeed by anticipating that he or she is going to fail. I don't know anybody like that. And so I think it's important that we expect to succeed. And I think that's possible. There are many times where people thought an organization would fail. I mean, the Washington Post, before Bezos acquired it, we were cutting every year. People were bemoaning what was happening there. And yes, they have their travails today, but we turned that around. The New York Times, it wasn't that long ago that people were talking about it going bankrupt. In 2009, they had to get a rescue loan from Carlos Slim in Mexico, $250 million. People said BuzzFeed News and Huffington Post were going to be the leading news organizations in the country. And guess what? The New York Times turned itself around. So it can be done, and I think there's a lot of reason for us to be optimistic.
Thank you very much. Are there questions among you to ask? Please, there should be a mic ready to, Richard is back here. Does anybody have a question? And Catherine back there. I know you're ready to eat, but could you just ask one or two questions? There's one over here. Thank you.
Thank you both so much for being here tonight. My question is not meant to be a hard one, but I recently graduated business school from the West Coast, and I was surprised by the number of my classmates that felt like religion as an identity group should not be protected in the same way that veterans groups or LGBTQ groups are protected. So I was wondering what you both think about that.
I'm just kind of stunned to hear that. It is in the Constitution, by the way. And by the way, you can't argue that you should have freedom of expression and not have freedom of religion, because religion is a form of expression. So I don't know why anybody would argue that, frankly. It's almost so hard to argue against, because I can't even understand what the reasoning for that would be. Look, if you want to look at the history of persecution over time, the history over centuries, people have been persecuted because of religion and by religion. And so, you need to, and so if you believe in freedom, then you should believe in freedom of faith as well.
Thank you. And then one more question?
Okay. So Marty, as a former investigative journalist, you actually sounded very optimistic to me. You did not sound pessimistic to me. I'm very pessimistic about kind of the future of investigative journalism, just because newsrooms have been shrunk so small. All the newspapers I live in Colorado, and we had 8 very big newspapers. They've all been consolidated by one company. So if you could elaborate a little bit more about your optimism of how you think that's going to turn around. So.
Sure. I'm not saying it's easy, and I'm not being Pollyannish. I certainly recognize all the challenges. I think in Denver, there are some nonprofits that have started up in Denver, as I believe. In Salt Lake, there have been nonprofits that have started up there, even with one of the newspapers going out of business. You look in San Francisco, the New York Times did a story about how many news organizations there are now in San Francisco. Many of them, some of them nonprofit. I'm on the board of one of those, and run by a friend of mine. And some of them are doing really good investigative work, and they're having an impact. And if you were to go back and look at some of the Pulitzers that have been handed out over the last several years, many of them have gone to news organizations. One of them, sort of a well-known media analyst, Ken Doctor, started a nonprofit in California, and they won a Pulitzer Prize. And they've only been in existence for 5 years. And I'm not using the Pulitzer Prize as the total measure. I wish there were more, but I have to say that some of the commercial enterprises weren't doing such a great job of investigating either. It's before Spotlight, investigative reporting was really atrophying at many of these news organizations. People were saying we're going to cut that back. Because why? Because it costs a lot of money, it takes a lot of time, it doesn't generate necessarily enough traffic, and it can't guarantee a result. And so people were cutting back. And I think one of the benefits of Spotlight, the movie, because it took a movie to kind of send the message to people. The story came out in 2002. The movie came out in 2015. I mean, it's at a place like the San Francisco Chronicle, the publisher went to his editor and said, after watching the movie, and said, maybe we should create that investigative unit that you've been proposing. And she said, really? You're going to accept this now because you saw a movie? And you know what? But take what you can get. And if that's what it takes to persuade a publisher to have an investigative unit, hey, terrific. So, and I think that at a lot of news organizations, they are doing a lot of really great investigative work. I wish there were more, but I hesitate to romanticize what existed before, because frankly, before that movie came out, a lot of people were cutting back on investigative reporting even then. We can always use more.
One more question?
I have a question over here. Could you speak to the personal impact and consequences that you faced as a result of telling this story, and how you navigated holding your head up high through what I would have to imagine was an incredibly challenging time?
Yeah, it wasn't as challenging as you imagine. I was proud of the work that we had done. It had an immediate impact. The church, the archdiocese proposed a set of reforms. They were clearly inadequate. There was an effort on their part to just get through the immediate crisis. I mean, the Cardinal Laud, he wouldn't even answer our questions. He told the Spotlight team, "I don't even want to know what your questions are." Well, his PR people said that, and then he called me to tell me that he wasn't going to cooperate. I told him I thought that was a mistake, but that we were going to publish anyway. And the story was it had an enormous impact in Boston right away. And we were not attacked by Catholic parishioners in Boston. Some, yes, but not most. Not, and they were actually quite. They were very upset with Cardinal Law and with some of the bishops there, and with the church overall, and that was gratifying actually to me to hear that from them, and it gave us the motivation to just keep going. I mean, we didn't need the motivation; we had our own journalistic motivation, but it was helpful to have that. And I lived in the South End of Boston, which was I lived a block away from the Cathedral of the Holy Cross, which is where the biggest cathedral there. And I always was expecting somebody's going to come over and stone my place, and I always thought I'm so lucky to be living on the 4th floor. They're going to have a hard time reaching me, but nobody ever did anything. And I had a lot of expressions of gratitude from survivors, from clergy, from a lot of the leading members of the Catholic Church, people who were lay leaders in the community. And over time, I was very grateful for that. I had one of them who was the finance chair, I think, for the Archdiocese, one of the most influential people in Boston. And when I was in Washington, he asked me to attend an event where he was winning an award. And he's in the real estate business, and I'm like, what am I doing here? And he, in the middle of the thing, he was thanking various people. He thanked his wife, he thanked his kids, and then he pointed me out and he said, he saved my church. And I don't view that as I didn't save the church, but it was something that needed to be done. And I was just really proud of that, and felt that it's had a long-term beneficial effect on how people who've been abused, that they're now going to be listened to more closely than they were before. And so it wasn't really traumatic. I mean, there was one instance where, because I'm Jewish, that people thought that I would sort of somehow it would be a problem for me, that there would be anti-Semitism. I didn't really experience that. What I did experience is some people in the Jewish community were concerned that it would sort of hurt them, that it would be viewed as the Jewish community somehow attacking the church. And I had somebody come up to me at some event for Israel and express concerns about that. And I just said, that's not my problem. So, I'm pretty stoic. And it's just like, I'm doing my job. I think we're doing it right. And it's producing a good result. I think and so I wasn't traumatized at all.
Thank you so much, Marty. We really appreciate you being with us tonight.
Thank you.